Again, as Larry said, I'm from a little water district in Denver, Colorado. And one of the things about a water district is that we sometimes have this perception about trying to overhaul the system at our level. And so, as you can imagine, the first thing they think about in Denver, Colorado is, well, you have all the gold, you have all the stuff, you can overhaul that whole entire thing, which is not entirely true. Matter of fact, the two questions I always get when I'm done speaking or on the side talking to somebody is, hey, you're from Denver. He said, so when is John Elway going to run for governor? Or the latest one is, hey, what's the drive-through menu look like at a fast food chain now that we've passed some laws back in Colorado? So we have a whole definition of, Mile High City. So anyway, so we're a small town water district, and we'll give you a little bit of overview about our system in general. It's not Cherry Creek, the dam, which is the big guy right just south of Denver, if anybody's familiar with the South Metro Denver. We're a water district that serves about 55,000 to 60,000 now, up to 2019, and we're going to expand up to 70,000. So when East Cherry Creek was first development, we had nothing but wells in general and a couple chemical pumps, and we stored it in some storage tanks. Now we have, we're growing like everybody else. The water district has actually entertained some partnerships with all the other major entities that are serving up potable and non-potable water, one being Denver Water, as you know. So we have 2 treatment facilities now that do microfiltration, we do reverse osmosis, and we have the about several wells. As you can see there, the category is more than 50 water wells. Well, we actually have about 70 now, and we're planning on purchasing and getting some more land to do even more because the growth of Colorado, as you can imagine. We have about 40 plus a million gallons of storage that we serve, and the bigger last bullet point there is the 35 plus miles of linear pipe that goes from one extreme to the other extreme as far as geographical area. It runs along quite a few of our big highways now, and so the sharing of the water rights and the pipeline has become a huge deal in Colorado, as you can imagine. Now, what I call, it used to be the $1 million question, but now it's the Powerball question, right? And that is, how can we do better to secure our SCADA system before a major event happens somewhere in the world and with water utility? And I got this brought up to my attention. As you guys all know, we all have our specific and what I call loyal relationships with our vendors and our engineering firms, as well as our distributors and our contractors. And when I got brought up to this by a particular distributor, he's like, hey, Shay, what are you going to do about this cybersecurity issue? I'm like, what about this cybersecurity issue? And they're like, well, if you don't do something, something can happen. And I was like, well, I don't have to worry about it. Now, our system is so old and proprietary, who's going to get into a serial link? So, we had barely hit I said, I can barely keep up with trying to get up to just Ethernet protocol. So, the bigger thing there that, Larry had mentioned is it was the same feeling I got when people were saying, hey, what are you going to do about the PLC clocks when it turns over to the year 2000, right? Well, nothing really happened, even though we made a big stink about it, right? And then, so it feels like it's about education. So our engineering firms and our local distributors and their relationships with the product people came to our forefront and started educating particularly East Cherry Creek in this manner, and we started going down this path about how do we migrate. And the bigger thing there to me is, how do you migrate? Because the first thing I think of, with over 100 PLCs and some networking going in there, involving IT with the servers, which we barely hit the forefront, and then you got all your workstations accommodating all the facilities. You have to think about tying all the departments together and then moving forward from that. So the bigger thing was to bring the departments together, talk about it as a water district in whole, and ours was actually putting a portfolio together and making sure that not only because of the budget constraints putting together in front of the board, but then trying to get a game plan and some sort of outlook to see what's this going to look like long term. So I think the bigger question that we are still doing is, as we're massaging this and going through this, what steps can you take? And I think it's just like, again, what Larry was saying earlier, do you have to overhaul it all at once, or can you do this in migration steps? So hopefully this is an example that we'll try to put you guys through, or give you one from our perspective, and give you some insight about the little water district and how they're going about stuff like that. Some of the challenges that we've had, is changing that culture shift from the architecture, what you had. The water district always says, hey, why are you replacing this? It's been great for years. Yeah, but the problem is that you can't get more efficient, and especially when you're adding more of a team. Our water district started out with 20 employees. Now we're up to 50, which means you're taking on more of the responsibility and or the protection of your product, right? So that being said, as you can see, evolution is a big factor here. And architects change over time, of course. And again, how many people do you got in the pot that helps you decide on that? And then I think, again, because of the education knowledge and the two separate maybe departments or entities like the IT department versus the OT, was them to come together. And I will just say that as a water district, we're pretty personable, and I'm probably, every time people talk about how do you get along with your IT department, they're fantastic with us. And I think it's because of that growth and evolution that they were having. They were only doing IT side to the business level, and when they really had to start entertaining the OT level, things, actually persevered and went from there. So we have a pretty good, relationship. As I already mentioned about our high dollar serial networks, we have aging legacy systems. Even back in the day, I still sometimes think of a 16-bit architecture, but we are moving from 32-bit systems to 64. We have a mixture of multiple generations and stuff because, again, it takes time to overhaul the whole entire system. And then, of course, you do have radios with our wells that are communicating. We're trying to actually make the migration in that as well. So the bigger thing is, as you're trying to, migrate, is, hey, people still need water regardless. And so what's the downtime? You got to stay operational at the same time. And so some of that stuff has to be transparent to your product, right, and the people. So I think that's a big key factor here, which means sometimes you have to put things in place in case of a backup. So, I think that's real important in our water industry, that, that you're not letting the people know that, hey, you're changing this, and by the way, you're going to fill it in your water. Some of the stuff that, as with SCADA or a DCS changing in general, and we have a SCADA system, some of the things that come into play with efficiency is how much now does the operator / techs need to get involved and get into the system. So you think about, the security side of that, and, you start with the workstations, right? And you move to the authentications of and passwords and securities that start at basically the workstation level. And then you move up into, now the HTTPS communications and remote access. The technology side of things has moved from the OPC servers now to like OPC-UA. And, what happens, when you put these things in place, what kind of historical do you got? You know, do you have audit trails? You know, stuff like that. So I think these are all questions that have arose and we've done by an education standpoint in general. And we couldn't have done it without, again, the relationship of our local distributors and the product providers that have helped out. Beyond HMI and SCADA, I touched on that a little bit. Security between SCADA network and the control network, as you know, at the what I call at the lower level to the instrumentation level, you always have to think about maybe designing a different type of network that you had before. You know, you got so much, you only have so much bandwidth, and this kind of thing you got to think about. Does the infrastructure change? Absolutely. Then, you know, with that in mind, when you're down at that tier 1 level, does the PLC communications, do you put that, where do you go with that? Where it used to be on one top layer network level. So again, that was about the user security type things, right? And then of course our radio communications. Since we're trying to migrate from the serial world to the Ethernet, now you got to think about that kind of stuff too from a remote access standpoint. So those are all considerations from top to bottom at the what I call the peasant level for us. We're always having to deal with that so that we can make sure that we don't have any problems with that. Here's kind of the architecture when we first started out and looking at this. It's what I would call kind of a typical SCADA system that you have when you first start thinking about how you're going to be able to allow operators to do their job at 24/7. And so, you know, we started out with a 32-bit HMI SCADA system, you know, which had the OPC servers, which went down to what we call our data concentrators, which bring in all the radio communications from the wells. And what's not on this slide is, of course, is our treatment plants that actually have localization and different infrastructure there. And then we put that all on the business network, or all on the SCADA network going throughout the whole business district. So, you know, you got thick clients to do that. And now that you have this reporting and historical thing, which is necessary for all kinds of stuff, data logging, reports in general, you have a database. And how do you share that among a lot of people? As you guys know, we have state requirements that the state requires in general, so that, you know, we can pass on information, and it's also about well history and the table aquifers and going on from there. So how do you take that all into consideration and make that visible to your different entities that you're required to do, and then move forward into the security side of things? So you take small steps. And again, the first thing is, how do you get educated with that? And again, down to, you know, the INC type level, we started out with, you know, the top end, which is starting out with our SCADA system and the HMI. And, you know, they've moved, excuse me, they moved on in general from their 32-bit architecture. And of course, what comes along with that is all these enhancements, right? And so, you know, you make small strides like we did. We turned over from our 32-bit system to 64-bit architecture. And then we said, okay, now let's go down to one more step, and let's talk about how we would secure that from both sides of that. Because the HMI has to be now visible, as you can see, with the web HMI and the mobile HMI stuff now. You know, the iPads, your phones, can you do it from home, has really just transpired over evolution, right? And so now it makes, you know, the theory of okay, so who's hacking in or who's dialing in to really see our system? And so after you get past the HMI, and of course all the encryption through the firewalls and authentication and authorization, you then say, well, what if you had something that happens locally? And so we had to go back down to basically the PLC side and say, how can we protect from that? And so based on getting educated and knowledge from our local distributors, and again, their resources with the product services we put in place, we started going down this road about changing it at the PLC level. Because you think about it from a whole business / SCADA network system, but what about when somebody comes in locally and maybe somehow gets past your security door and gets right into the PLC? So again, over evolution, because we had serial and stuff like that, we said, well, let's see if we can take this in step. And the first step is to, migrate the PLC side of things and make sure that you got some local protection right off the bat. And so with that in mind, what comes out of this is a higher encrypted, policies that get embedded into particular products. And, with our particular product that we started evolving here, they have things in place that will now allow the encryption and the cybersecurity, a more difficult, almost bulletproof type of system. In fact, some of that you go, well, how am I going to manage all that? And so, now that the policies get put in place, now you have no choice but to entertain from an IT to the OT's part, some education there. And so we started going down this road about taking small chunks at a time and evolving that. What's the ideal situation, as you know, is to make everything down to the peasant level where just about everything is secured. And so we are in the process of, again, hitting the top layer levels, and then eventually the future outlook is going to be down to this individual system wherever you have an RTU and a PLC, just because you never know the nature of the beast about how people are trying to be creative and getting into your system. So with that in mind, I will let Chris come up, and Larry will help present it.
Actually, we're going to come up next.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Conrad, sorry.